Josie Hale pressed her hand over her youngest daughter's chest and felt almost nothing. Just the faint wet flutter of a child fighting to stay in this world. Outside, thunder cracked across the Montana sky. Inside, 5 children held their breath. And somewhere in the dark beyond the porch, a horse screamed and collapsed, dragging a bleeding man face first into the mud at her door. If you're new here, please subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss a story. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that Montana night and find out what one woman did when everything fell apart at once. The storm came in fast, the way Montana storms always did. No warning, no mercy, just a wall of black sky rolling down off the mountains like God had kicked something loose. Josie Hale was standing at the kitchen basin wringing out a wet cloth when the first crack of lightning lit up the valley, and she counted the seconds the way her husband used to teach her. 1, 2, 3, 4. The thunder followed low and rolling so close it rattled the tin cups on the shelf above the stove. She didn't jump. She hadn't jumped at loud sounds in a long time. There was too much to hold together to afford the luxury of startling. Baby Birdie had been feverish since Tuesday. Not the ordinary kind of fever that came with teething or a summer cold. This was something else, something heavy, that had settled deep into the child's small chest and refused to move. The baby coughed in her sleep, with a sound like wet cloth being wrung, and every time that sound crossed the cabin, Josie felt her own lungs tighten in answer. She dipped the cloth back into the basin. Cool water. That was all she had. Cool water and prayer and 5 children depending on her to hold the world in place by sheer force of will. Mama. Hattie's voice came from the doorway of the back room, quiet and careful, the way Hattie always spoke, like she was measuring every word before she spent it. The girl was 13, but carried herself older. She had her father's eyes and her grandmother's mouth and Josie's own stubbornness written in the set of her jaw. Birdie's making that sound again. I know. It's worse than this morning. I know, Hattie. Mama, I said I know. Josie wrung the cloth out a second time, harder than she needed to. I heard her. I'm coming. She crossed the main room and stepped past Sam, who was 6 years old and had fallen asleep sitting up against the wall with his boot still on his head, tipped sideways at an angle that looked uncomfortable. She paused long enough to ease him down flat and pull a blanket over his shoulders. He didn't wake. He never woke once he was out. That boy could sleep through a cattle stampede, and some nights she envied him that more than she could say. In the far corner, closest to the wall, Clementine sat cross-legged on the floor with her back against the wooden slats and her knees pulled to her chest. She was 10 years old, and she hadn't spoken a single word in 7 months, not since the day her father's body was carried back from the eastern pasture on the back of a flatbed wagon. The doctor in town called it grief shock. Ezra called it stubbornness. Josie called it the thing she cried about after the children were asleep. Clementine watched her mother walk past with those wide, dark eyes that saw everything and said nothing. Josie touched the girl's hair briefly as she passed. Clementine didn't pull away. That was something. Birdie was in the back room in the small rope bed, 3 years old, and so pale she looked like she'd been carved from candle wax. Her little chest rose and fell in quick, uneven shudders, and the sound she made wasn't quite a cough and wasn't quite breathing. It was something in between, something wet and labored that turned Josie's stomach cold every time she heard it. Josie sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the cool cloth to the baby's forehead, and Birdie's eyes didn't open. They hadn't opened in hours. She needs a doctor, Hattie said from the doorway. Nearest doctor is 16 miles out. Then we need to send Ezra. Ezra's not riding 16 miles in a lightning storm in the middle of the night. Josie kept her voice flat and even. Not because she was calm, because calm was the only thing she had left to give them. We're managing. Are we? She looked at her daughter. Hattie looked back. 13 years old, and the girl already knew how to ask the questions that hurt. Yes, Josie said. We are. Hattie's jaw tightened. She turned and walked back into the main room without another word, and Josie heard the soft thud of the front door being tested. Ezra checking the latch the way he did every night now, the way his father used to. The boy was 15, and had decided 6 months ago that grief was a thing you worked through with your hands, and so he worked. He checked latches and mended fences and split wood until his palms bled, and he watched every man who came near his mother's property like a hawk watches a field mouse. Josie didn't know whether to be grateful or frightened by what her son was becoming. She pressed the cloth to Bertie's chest and listened to the rain come. It hit the roof in a solid sheet so heavy it sounded like gravel being poured from a great height, and the wind picked up fast enough to whistle through the gaps in the window frame that Josie had been meaning to seal for 3 weeks. She added it to the list she kept in her head. The list that never got shorter. She was still sitting there, still listening, still holding the cloth against her baby's chest, when she heard the horse. Not the sound of hooves on dry ground, she knew that sound. This was different. This was a horse in distress, the kind of high-strangled cry that an animal makes when it's past exhaustion and into something worse. It came from the direction of the front gate, close enough that Josie's head came up immediately. Then came the crash, not thunder. Something solid hitting the ground, something heavy. She was on her feet before she made the decision to stand. Ezra. She was already moving through the main room. Ezra, stay inside. But Ezra was already at the door. He was holding the old Remington rifle that had belonged to his father, and his face in the lamplight was set hard with the kind of expression that shouldn't belong on a 15-year-old. I heard it. I said stay inside. Mama, Ezra Thomas Hale. She put her hand on his arm, not grabbing, just resting. Put that rifle down and step back. He didn't put it down, but he stepped back. 1 step. It was as much as she was going to get. Josie opened the door. The rain came in sideways and cold, soaking her dress in the first 3 seconds. She stepped onto the porch and grabbed the post and squinted out into the dark. And the next flash of lightning came exactly when she needed it. A full white bloom of light across the yard. The horse was down. A big roan collapsed on its side in the mud, 20 feet from the porch steps, sides heaving, one leg bent at a wrong angle. And behind it, tangled in the reins, dragged through the mud like a rag doll, someone had thrown from a great height, was a man. He wasn't moving. Josie stood there for 1 full breath. Then she stepped off the porch into the rain. Mama? Ezra's voice cracked behind her. Mama, you don't know who that is? Mama, wait. She didn't wait. She never waited when something needed doing. That was the part of herself she'd stopped apologizing for. She crossed the yard in the rain and mud and knelt down beside the man. He was face down. She grabbed his shoulder and turned him. He was heavier than she expected, dense with muscle, and when she got him onto his back, she saw the blood immediately. Dark and wet, soaking through his shirt from somewhere below his left ribs. A wound not fresh, the kind that had been wrapped and then pushed through too hard and torn open again. His face was weathered and dark with stubble, maybe 40 years old, maybe older. She couldn't tell. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow. He had the look of a man who had been running from something for a long time and had finally run past the edge of his body's willingness to cooperate. Is he dead? Sam's voice. She turned to find him standing on the porch in his stocking feet, the blanket she'd put over him dragging in the wet. Sam, get back inside. Put your boots on. Is he dead, Mama? No, get inside. He looks dead. Samuel Hale, I will not tell you again. Sam disappeared. Josie turned back to the man on the ground and made a decision, the same kind of decision she'd been making for 6 months. The ones that didn't feel like decisions at all, because there was only ever one real answer. You helped. You helped because you were the kind of person who helped, and because standing there deciding whether to help was a luxury that people with options could afford, and Josie Hale had not had options for a long time. Ezra, she called. I need you. A pause. Then the sound of boots on the porch steps. Ezra came down into the rain with the rifle still in his hand, and his mouth a straight line of disapproval. He looked at the man on the ground, and then looked at his mother, and she could see him working through it. The thing she loved about Ezra, and the thing that drove her to the edge of her patience, the way he had to reason through everything before he acted. We don't know who he is, Ezra said. No, we don't. He could be dangerous. He's half dead and bleeding. Ezra, help me get him inside. Inside. Ezra said it like she'd suggested something unreasonable. You want to bring a stranger inside our house. I want to bring a man who is about to die inside our house so he does not die on our property in the rain. She looked at her son. Yes or no, are you going to help me? Ezra looked at the rifle in his hand. He looked at the man in the mud. Something moved across his face. Anger, and under the anger, something younger, something afraid. He propped the rifle against the fence post. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. Getting the man inside was harder than it had any right to be. He was dead weight, and the rain made everything slippery, and Josie's arms were shaking by the time they got him through the door and down onto the floor near the stove. Hattie appeared from the hallway with her eyes wide and a butcher knife held flat against her thigh. Josie noticed it and said nothing because she understood it. Who is he? Hattie asked. I don't know. Is he going to die? Josie was already cutting his shirt away from the wound with the kitchen shears. Not if I can help it. She looked up. Hattie, water, boiling, now. Hattie moved. Clementine had come out of her corner and was standing against the far wall watching. Her dark eyes moved from the man's face to her mother's hands, to the blood on the floor, methodical and calm, the way she watched everything, like she was recording it all somewhere inside herself where no one else could reach. The wound was bad. Not immediately fatal, but bad. Something had gone into him, she couldn't tell what a bullet or a blade, and whoever had patched it had done a decent job. And then the man had clearly ignored every reasonable instruction about rest and movement, and pushed his body until the patchwork came apart. There was infection starting at the edges. She could smell it. She pressed clean cloth against it, and the man's body reacted a full involuntary tightening of every muscle, a sharp intake of breath, and his eyes opened. They were gray. She noticed that first. Gray and direct, and even in the state he was in, sharply alert. He looked at her face, and then at the room, and then back at her face, and he did it fast, the way a man looks at a space when he's checking exits. Easy, she said. He didn't say anything. His jaw was clenched against pain. You fell off your horse in my yard. She kept her voice matter-of-fact, the way she'd learned to speak in these situations. No room for panic, just information. You've got a wound in your side that's come open. I'm going to clean it and close it as best I can, and you're going to hold still. His eyes moved to Ezra, who was standing 3 feet away with his arms crossed and his face like a closed door. Then his eyes moved past Ezra, past Hattie at the stove, past Clementine at the wall, and stopped. Stopped at the doorway to the back room where the sound was coming from. Birdie. Her wet, labored coughing carrying through the thin wall. Something shifted in the man's face. He turned his eyes back to Josie. That child. His voice was rough, barely there. How long has she been coughing like that? Josie's hand stilled on the cloth. That's not your concern right now. How long? 3 days. She said it before she meant to. Something in his voice pulled the answer out of her. It started Tuesday. Fever first. Then this. He tried to push himself up. She put her hand flat on his chest and held him down without being gentle about it. You are not getting up, she said. That sound. He stopped. Swallowed. His gray eyes were focused now, intent. The pain pushed back behind something urgent. That sound your child is making, that is not a cold. That is not a fever cough. That child is drowning inside her own lungs. And if you don't do something in the next hour, she will not see morning. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Josie felt the ripple of them move through her chest, felt the way they confirmed every fear she'd been holding back with both hands since Tuesday. You don't know that, she said. But her voice wasn't steady anymore. I know exactly what that is. His gray eyes held hers without flinching. I am a surgeon. I was a surgeon. And I am telling you that child needs steam. Hot, continuous steam right now. A tent over her head and boiling water beneath it, and someone holding it steady for at least an hour. He paused. I can tell you exactly how to do it, but you have to let me sit up. The room was completely silent. Hattie stood frozen at the stove with the water pot in her hands. Ezra hadn't moved. Even Clementine in her corner seemed to be holding her breath. Josie looked at the man on her floor. She looked at the wound in his side. She looked at his gray eyes, direct and clear, and asking for nothing except to be believed. Then she looked at the doorway to the back room, where her youngest daughter was making the sound of a child losing ground. She made her decision. "Ezra," she said quietly. "Help him up." Ezra's head snapped toward her. "Mama." "Help him up." Ezra's jaw worked. Every muscle in his body was pulling against the instruction. But he crossed the room and got a hand under the man's arm and hauled him to a sitting position. And when the man hissed in pain, Ezra's grip steadied automatically, the same instinct for doing the job right that lived in every Hale she'd ever known. The man got his feet under him and stood gray-faced and swaying with blood soaking through the fresh cloth at his side. He looked at Josie. "What's her name?" he asked. "Birdie." "And she's how old?" "3." He nodded once. "All right." He moved toward the back room, slow and deliberate, one hand pressed to his side. "I'm going to need your biggest pot, boiling water, and a blanket heavy as you've got. And somebody needs to hold her." "I'll hold her," Josie said. She was already moving. "I know you will," he said. He didn't say it like a compliment or like comfort. He said it like a fact, like he'd already understood something about her from 3 minutes in her kitchen. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he came from or why he was bleeding or what he was running from. She didn't know if he was a good man or a dangerous one or something in between. But she picked up her child and held her close and followed a wounded stranger's instructions in the dark of a Montana storm. And somewhere in the middle of the steam and the heat and the long, desperate hour that followed, Baby Birdie's breathing began very slowly, very slightly to ease, and Josie Hale sat on the floor of her own back room, with her face wet and her arms aching, and the man she didn't know sitting propped against the wall across from her, with his eyes open and his voice steady, talking her through every minute of it. And she thought, I don't know if this is salvation or catastrophe. But she thought it quietly, the way she thought most things, and she kept holding on. The hour Josie spent on that floor with Birdie was the longest of her life, and that was saying something because she had lived through a great many long hours. Silas. She learned his name somewhere around the 40-minute mark, when he told her to shift the blanket, and she asked what she should call him, and he said, Silas Wade, like it cost him something to say it out loud. Silas talked her through every minute of it with the kind of steady, unhurried precision that told her he had done this before, not once or twice, but many times in conditions far worse than a Montana farmhouse kitchen. Keep the blanket tight on the sides. Don't let the steam escape from the bottom. It's slipping. Hold it with your knee. Yes, like that. Now don't move. She's crying. That's good. Crying means she's breathing. Let her cry. Josie let her cry. She held the blanket tent over her daughter's small head and listened to Birdie sob and cough and fight, and she did not cry herself because there was no room for it, and because Silas was watching her with those gray eyes from across the room, and she would not fall apart in front of a stranger. Ezra stood in the doorway the entire time with his arms crossed and his eyes moving between Silas and his mother and his baby sister in an endless loop, and he did not speak and he did not leave. That was Ezra's version of accepting a situation. He didn't approve it, but he stayed. Hattie brought fresh boiling water twice without being asked. She timed it by some internal clock Josie had never taught her, and didn't know where she'd gotten. 13 years old, and already more competent than most grown women Josie had known in her life. Sam had fallen back asleep against the wall in the hallway, curled around his blanket with his mouth open. He had woken long enough to look into the room, decide the situation was being handled by adults, and gone back to sleep with the uncomplicated trust of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to be afraid of the world. Clementine did not sleep. She sat in the doorway behind Ezra, small and still watching Silas with an expression that Josie could not read and had long stopped trying to. When Birdie's breathing finally began to open up, to lose that terrible wet rattle and come in fuller and slower and easier, Josie felt it through her palms before she heard it. The child's chest rising more cleanly. The cough shifting from drowning to clearing. She pressed her hand flat against Birdie's small back and felt the difference, and for one suspended moment she could not speak at all. There, Silas said quietly. There she is. Josie nodded. She did not trust her voice. She'll need to stay warm tonight. Keep her slightly elevated, roll something under the head of the mattress. And watch for the fever. If it spikes again before morning, start the steam again. Don't wait. I won't, Josie said. Her voice came back steady. She was grateful for that. She got Bertie settled and turned around, and found Silas had gone gray around the edges in a way that told her the hour had cost him considerably more than he'd let on. He was still sitting propped against the wall, but he'd slid down several inches, and his hand was pressed hard to his side, and the cloth beneath it was wet again. You're bleeding, she said. I'm aware. Why didn't you say something? You were busy. She crossed the room and knelt beside him, and pulled his hand away from the wound to look at it, and he let her, which told her more about his condition than any amount of words would have. A man who let a woman he didn't know pull his hand away from his own body was a man who had nothing left to argue with. Ezra, she said, bring me the lamp. Ezra brought it without a word. She worked on Silas's wound for the better part of another hour, and he sat through it without complaining, which she respected, and gave her instructions when she needed them, which she respected more. He knew what he was doing with a wound. He knew the difference between what needed immediate attention and what could wait. He told her where the infection was worst, and what to clean it with, and how tight to draw the binding, and she followed his directions with the same calm focus she'd brought to Bertie, and when it was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. Where did you learn all this? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Army, he said finally. You served. I did. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. Not yet. She helped him to the main room and got him settled on the floor near the stove with a blanket and a pillow, and she told him she would check on him before dawn, and he said that wasn't necessary, and she said she wasn't asking his opinion, and something moved at the corner of his mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile, or might have been pain. She couldn't tell. She lay down on her own bed for 3 hours and did not sleep, and listened to the rain slow and stop and the night go quiet. And she thought about a man who carried surgical knowledge in his hands, and a wound in his side, and a name he said, like it cost him something. And she thought about her children, and her land, and the list of things she needed to do before the week was out. And somewhere around 4 in the morning, she stopped thinking, and simply lay there in the dark, and breathed, which was sometimes the most a person could do. Morning came hard and bright, the way Montana mornings did. After a storm, the sky washed clean, and the light almost aggressive in its cheerfulness. Silas was awake when she came out. He was sitting up with his back against the wall, and his eyes open, and he'd somehow gotten himself close enough to the window to watch the yard without appearing to be watching it. She noticed that the angle of his body, the way his sight line was positioned, and filed it away. Coffee, she said, if it's no trouble. If it were trouble, I wouldn't have offered. She made coffee and handed him a cup, and he held it in both hands and didn't say thank you, which she found she didn't mind. She'd known men who said thank you constantly and meant nothing by it, and men who said nothing and meant everything. She was still deciding which kind he was. Bertie woke up hungry, which was the best sign imaginable, and Sam woke up and immediately demanded to know who the man by the stove was. And Silas looked at Sam with an expression that suggested he did not have extensive experience with 6-year-olds. And Sam looked back with the completely unguarded curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that some questions are better not asked. What happened to your face? Sam said. Sam. Josie's voice was a warning. I'm just asking. He's got a scar. People have scars. It's not your business. It's all right, Silas said. He looked at Sam. Horse kicked me. Sam considered this with enormous seriousness. Did you kick it back? Silas blinked. No. That's why it kicked you again, probably. Samuel. Josie pressed her fingers to her forehead. But Silas was quiet for a moment, looking at Sam with something that was harder to categorize, now not quite amusement, but something close to it, something that looked like a door opening a crack. That's probably right, he said. Ezra came in from morning chores and stopped when he saw Silas at the stove, and his face went through 3 distinct expressions in about 2 seconds: surprise, recalculation, and then the return of the closed, watchful look he'd been wearing since the night before. He hung his hat on the hook by the door and poured himself coffee and stood against the far wall in a way that made the room feel smaller than it was. The morning moved awkwardly, the way mornings do when there is an unresolved situation sitting in the middle of them that everyone is carefully not discussing. Silas ate what Josie put in front of him without comment. He did not overstay the conversation or try to fill silences which she appreciated. He helped himself to the basin to wash without asking which she appreciated less, but she said nothing. It was Hattie who broke the careful quiet. She was washing the breakfast plates, and she said without turning around, "You said you were an army surgeon." "That's right," Silas said. "What army?" "Union. 13th Infantry, Army of the Potomac." Hattie turned around now. She was holding a wet plate and looking at him with the expression she used when she was working something out. "The war ended 20 years ago." "It did." "So you've been a surgeon for 20 years since." "Some of those years." He said it evenly, giving her exactly as much as she'd asked for, and not a word more. Hattie set the plate down. "What happened to the other years?" Josie said. "Hattie?" "It's a fair question," Hattie said, and still looking at Silas. And Silas looked back at her with something that might have been respect. "Yes," he said. "It is." I didn't answer it. But he didn't look away either, and Hattie held his gaze for a long moment, and then picked her plate back up and went back to washing, and whatever she'd been working out seemed to have reached some intermediate conclusion she wasn't ready to share. The day passed. Silas rested because he had no choice. Josie told him flatly that if he tried to put weight on that side before she'd seen it hold through a full night, she would not be responsible for what happened, and he received this instruction with the same stillness with which he seemed to receive most things. He sat near the stove or near the window. He watched the yard. He watched the children. He watched Clementine, not in a way that was uncomfortable, not staring, not pressing. Just the occasional quiet look, the kind you give something you're trying to understand without disturbing it. Clementine noticed. She always noticed everything. But she didn't retreat to her corner when he looked, which was unusual. Clementine retreated from most things. On the second afternoon, Sam dragged a wooden horse across the room and sat down 3 feet from Silas and began playing an elaborate game that seemed to involve considerable narration and at least 6 different voices. Silas watched this for several minutes without expression. Then he said, "Is the brown one the sheriff or the outlaw?" Sam looked up with the expression of someone who has found an unexpected ally. "He's both," Sam said. "Depending." "Depending on what?" "On who's asking." Silas was quiet. "That's complicated," he said. "Life is complicated," Sam said with the profound certainty of a 6-year-old repeating something he'd heard, and went back to his game. Josie, standing in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands, watched this exchange and felt something shift very slightly, deep and quiet in the place where she kept things she was not yet ready to name. It was Ezra who found it. He'd ridden into town for feed supplies on the 3rd morning against Josie's preference and with her grudging permission, and he came back in the early afternoon with his face set in a way she recognized immediately as bad news being held very tightly under control. He unsaddled his horse and put the supplies away, and came inside and waited until Sam was in the back room with Bertie, and Hattie was hanging laundry before he spoke. He put a piece of paper on the table. It was a wanted notice, printed on cheap stock with a rough drawing that didn't entirely look like Silas, but was clearly meant to. The name was right. The description was close enough. Wanted for desertion in the face of the enemy. Silas Wade, formerly captain, 13th Infantry. Reward $500. Josie looked at the paper. Then she looked at her son. Ezra's voice was controlled, but just barely. "Every feed store and sheriff's office between here and Billings has one of those," he said. "Tom Aldrich recognized the name when I told him where I was from. He didn't know I had any reason to be interested. But he will, Mama. People talk." He paused. $500 is more money than we've seen in 2 years. "I know how much money it is, Ezra. Do you know what people in this county would do for $500? And I know exactly what people in this county would do for $500. She kept her voice even. "Where is he?" "Out back, checking the fence line. You told him he could walk if he kept to the property." She picked up the notice off the table. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she walked out the back door. Silas was at the far end of the fence line, moving slowly but steadily, testing the posts with one hand while keeping his other arm close to his side. He heard her coming and turned, and when he saw her face, he went very still. She held up the notice. He looked at it. He looked at her. He did not say anything. "Desertion," she said. "That's a serious accusation." "Yes." "Is it true?" Howe was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't evasion, but calculation, working out how much truth to give, and in what order. She'd seen that kind of quiet before, and it had taught her to wait. "I disobeyed a direct order," he said finally. "That's not the same as desertion." "No, it isn't." His gray eyes were level. "The order was to move a field hospital. We were told the civilians in the area had been evacuated. They hadn't been. There were 43 people, women, children, 2 old men sheltering in a church 200 yards from the position we were ordered to abandon. I refused to leave." He paused. "The officer who gave the order had reasons to want me removed. The desertion charge was convenient." Josie looked at him for a long time. "That's a story that's very easy to tell," she said, "and very hard to prove." "I know. $500 is what's standing between my children and a bad winter, Mr. Wade. I want you to understand that. I want you to understand that I am not a woman with the luxury of making decisions based on feelings." "I understand that." "Do you?" "Yes, ma'am." His voice was quiet and steady. "And I'm not going to tell you what to do with that paper. That's your decision to make. I'll wait by the back fence if you want to send for the sheriff. I won't run." She looked at him. At the wound in his side that she had cleaned with her own hands. At the fence post he'd been testing because he'd seen it was loose, and it needed doing, and he'd done it without being asked. She folded the wanted notice in half. She put it in her apron pocket. She said, "The corner post is rotting at the base. You'll need to pack it with wet clay before it'll hold." Silas looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his eyes, not quite surprise, but something close to it. The look of a man who has braced for one thing and been given another. "I'll see to it," he said. She turned and walked back to the house. Inside, Ezra was still standing at the table with his arms crossed and his face hard. He looked at her empty hands. "Mama." His voice cracked on the word. "Mama, we need that money." "No," she said quietly, moving past him to the stove. "We need this winter, and there's a difference." Ezra stared at her back. She could feel it. She kept her hands busy. "He could be lying," Ezra said. "Everything he said could be a lie." "It could be." "And you don't care." She turned around then. Her son was standing there, 15 years old, trying so hard to be the man he thought the situation required, and behind the hard jaw and the crossed arms, he was still so young it hurt to look at him. "I care very much," she said. "And I am watching, and I am deciding. And that is all any of us can do, Ezra. Watch and decide and try not to be wrong about the things that matter." She held his gaze. "Now go check on Bertie." He went. She turned back to the stove. Outside, she heard the sound of Silas working the fence post, the dull, rhythmic labor of a man doing a small job carefully, and she stood there with her hand resting on the warm side of the stove, and told herself she had made a calculated decision, not an emotional one. She told herself that firmly. She wasn't entirely sure she believed it. Virgil Crane came on a Tuesday. Josie knew the name before she knew the man. Everyone in the valley knew the name. Crane owned 3 water rights upstream, 2 timber contracts with the territorial government, and the patience of a man who understood that waiting cost him nothing, while it cost everyone else everything. He had been circling the Hale property for 8 months, since before her husband was cold in the ground, sending polite letters through a lawyer in Billings that grew slightly less polite with each passing week. She had not responded to any of them. She was in the yard hanging wash when the riders came through the gate. 4 men on good horses, well dressed in the way that money dresses itself when it wants to remind you of the distance between you. Crane himself rode in front, a tall man, lean somewhere past 60, but carrying it well with a silver watch chain across his vest, and the kind of face that had learned long ago how to look reasonable while saying unreasonable things. Silas was splitting wood at the far end of the yard. He stopped when the riders came through. He set the axe down slowly, one deliberate movement, and stood with his arms at his sides and watched. He didn't move toward the house, and he didn't move away. He just watched, and Josie was aware of him. The way you are aware of a thing positioned between you and a problem. Crane tipped his hat from horseback. Mrs. Hale, Mr. Crane. She didn't move to meet him. She kept the wet sheet in her hands and finished hanging it. You're a long way from Billings. I had business in the valley. He swung down off his horse with the ease of a man accustomed to being helped and not requiring it. His riders stayed mounted. I thought it past time we spoke in person. Your letters. I haven't sent any letters. No. A pause. No, you haven't. He smiled. It reached his eyes in the way that a calculation reaches a ledger, technically present, fundamentally cold. That's rather what I mean. We have matters to discuss, Mrs. Hale. The water easement. The northern boundary survey. These things don't improve with silence. My property line hasn't moved. That's a matter of some legal debate, actually. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. I had a survey completed last month. The northeastern corner of your property, the section that includes the creek access, sits on land that was originally granted under a territorial charter that has since been reviewed and revised. I'm afraid your claim to that water access isn't as clear as you may have believed. Josie looked at this document without taking it. I have a deed. You have a deed to the homestead proper. The water rights are a separate question. He kept his voice pleasant. It was a specific kind of pleasant, the kind that is deployed like a weapon. I'm not here to cause you hardship, Mrs. Hale. I'm here because I believe we can reach an agreement that's fair to both parties. I'm prepared to offer you a purchase price for the northeastern section that would give you enough capital to... No. The word came out simple and flat, and Crane stopped speaking. In the silence, Josie heard the back door of the house open. She heard Ezra's boots on the porch steps. She did not turn to look. Crane looked at Ezra. Then he looked at Silas at the far end of the yard. His expression remained pleasant, but something recalculated behind his eyes. Mrs. Hale, he said, I'd encourage you to think carefully. The legal process, if it comes to that, would be expensive and prolonged. A woman in your position, a woman in my position, Josie said, has heard everything you're saying before and answered it the same way. She finally reached out and took the document from his hand. She folded it once and held it at her side. I'll have my own lawyer look at this. If you have a legitimate legal claim, file it. Until then, you're standing on my property, and I'd ask you to leave it. Crane looked at her for a long moment. The pleasant expression didn't move, which was almost more frightening than anger would have been. Of course, he said. He put his hat back on and turned to his horse. I hope you'll reconsider. The offer won't remain open indefinitely. He mounted and gathered his reins and looked back at her from the saddle. His eyes moved briefly, deliberately to Silas at the far end of the yard. I see you've taken on a hand. Good to have help out here, isolated as you are. He rode out. His men followed. Josie stood in the yard until the sound of hooves faded, and then she released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Ezra was beside her. What did he give you? She handed him the document. He read it, and his face went through the same tight sequence it always did when he was holding something bad. This says we don't own the creek access. It says his surveyor says we don't. That's the same thing if it goes to a judge. It's not the same thing. She took the paper back. Not yet. Silas had crossed the yard and was standing a few feet away. He hadn't come close enough to intrude and hadn't stayed far enough to pretend he hadn't been watching. He looked at the document in her hand. Crane, he said. You know him, by reputation. His voice was careful. He's been acquiring water rights across 3 counties for the better part of a decade. He doesn't buy what people are willing to sell. He buys what he can make people unable to keep. He paused. That survey, it's almost certainly manufactured. But manufactured legal claims still have to be answered in court, and court costs money, which we don't have, Ezra said, looking at Silas with the specific hostility of someone who resents a stranger being right. Which you don't have. Silas agreed without flinching from the look. You'll need documentation. Your original deed, any correspondence that establishes the water access as part of the homestead claim. And you'll need someone who knows territorial land law. The nearest lawyer is in Miles City, Josie said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I know someone who knows the land codes here. An old army contact, he went into land law after the war. If you could get a letter to him, he might... Why would you help with this? Ezra's voice was sharp. You've been here less than a week. This isn't your problem. Silas looked at him. No, he said. It isn't. I didn't say anything else. He turned and walked back toward the fence line and picked up his axe and went back to work, and Ezra watched him go with an expression that was equal parts suspicion and something he didn't know how to name. That night, after the children were down, Josie sat at the table with her husband's original land documents spread out in front of her. The lamp was low and the house was quiet, and she was working through the language of the territorial deed, with the concentration of a woman who had taught herself to read legal text out of pure necessity. She did not hear Silas get up, but she heard him sit down across from her. She didn't look up. You should be resting. I've rested enough. He looked at the documents on the table. May I? She slid them toward him. He read without speaking, his finger moving along the text the way a man reads when he is reading for precision, not for comprehension. She watched his face without appearing to. There was something in the way he read, the same stillness that was in everything he did, but underneath it something focused and quick. Here, he said, and turned a page toward her. This line. This establishes the water access as appurtenant to the property, meaning it's legally attached, not separate. Any survey claiming the creek rights are independent of the homestead deed contradicts this language. He paused. This is defensible. A good lawyer would have this thrown out. And if the judge is in Crane's pocket... He looked at her. Is he? I don't know. I don't know who Crane has and who he doesn't. She leaned back in her chair. This valley has been his for 20 years. My husband used to say that Crane owned the water and the water owned everything else. Your husband sounds like he was a clear-eyed man. He was. She said it simply, without grief and without distance. He died in March, Hart the doctor said. He was 44 years old. Silas was quiet. He didn't say he was sorry. She found she was grateful for that she had received enough condolences in the past 6 months to last several lifetimes, and most of them had landed like stones in still water, heavy and useless. How long have you been alone? He asked. I have not been alone, she said. I have 5 children. He looked at her. That's not what I meant. She held his gaze for a moment. I know what you meant. She reached out and gathered the document. Get some sleep, Mr. Wade. I need you functional tomorrow. The north fence has 3 more posts to check. He stood. He was moving. The wound was holding the infection, drawing back under whatever internal stubbornness he was applying to it. He picked up the lamp to carry it back to his sleeping spot by the stove, and then he stopped. Mrs. Hale. His voice was low. Crane's men were looking at your yard more than Crane was. The one on the gray horse, he was counting windows. Josie went very still. Counting windows. Cataloging exits. His gray eyes were level. I don't know what he's planning, but I'd put a bar on the back door tonight. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she got up and went to the back door and dropped the bar into its brackets. She turned around and found Silas watching her with that look she'd started to recognize, not approval exactly, more like acknowledgement. The look of a man who respects competence without needing to announce it. Good night, Mr. Wade, she said. Good night, Mrs. Hale. She went to her room. She did not sleep well, but she slept. 3 days later, word came from town. Hattie brought it. She'd gone in with Ezra for supplies and come back with her face carefully composed in a way that meant the news was bad, and she was deciding how to deliver it. She waited until Sam was outside and Silas was at the fence before she told her mother. Tom Aldrich knows, Hattie said. He knows there's a wanted man staying here. He's been talking. Mama, the sheriff's deputy, was asking questions at the feed store this morning, asking whether anyone had seen a man matching Silas's description. Josie sat down. She did this sometimes when the information required it. She sat and she thought, and then she stood up and dealt with it. The sitting was not weakness, it was processing. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "I don't know. Ezra thinks maybe 2 days before someone puts it together well enough to act on." "Where is Ezra now?" "Outside. He's Mama. He's angry." "I know he's angry." "Not at Silas." Hattie paused. "Or not only at Silas. He's angry because he thinks you're in a position you didn't choose, and he doesn't know how to fix it, and that makes him angry at everything." Josie looked at her daughter, 13 years old. "You understand a great deal," she said quietly. "I pay attention." Hattie looked at her steadily. "What are we going to do?" Before Josie could answer, the front door opened, and Ezra came in. He'd clearly been standing on the porch long enough to hear the last part of the conversation, because he came in with his jaw set and his eyes already made up. "He has to leave," Ezra said. "Tonight if possible. Every day he's here is another day we're liable." "Liable for what?" Josie said. "We didn't know who he was when we brought him in. We know now. That's what matters legally." Ezra's voice was controlled and hard. "Mama harboring a wanted man, that's something Crane could use. You understand that he doesn't need the water rights if he can get a judge to rule against you on criminal grounds. He's probably already thinking about it." The room went very quiet, because it was true. Josie could see it, the shape of it, the way it fit, and the cold efficiency of it. Crane didn't need to win the legal case about the water. He just needed another angle, and a widow harboring a deserter was an angle sharp enough to cut with. "Send him away," Ezra said. "Let him figure out his own situation. We have enough of our own." The back door opened. Silas came in. He looked at the three of them standing in the kitchen, at Josie's face, and Hattie's and Ezra's, and he understood the conversation immediately. She could see him understand it, watch the pieces arrange themselves behind his eyes. He said, "I'll go tonight." Ezra nodded. Something in his shoulders released. But Josie said nothing. She was looking at Silas. He was standing in her kitchen with his hand resting on the doorframe and his face composed in the way she'd come to associate with him, receiving difficult information, accepting it fully, making no argument against reality. He had already accepted that he would go. He had already, she realized, been aware this was coming. "There's a problem with that," she said. Ezra turned to look at her. "Mama, if he leaves tonight and the deputy comes asking tomorrow, we've admitted guilt by his absence. A man who was here for innocent reasons doesn't disappear in the night." She looked at Ezra steadily. "If he goes, we look like we were hiding something. If we were hiding something, Crane has exactly what he needs." Silence. Hattie was the first to speak. "She's right," she said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone announcing the weather. "If he runs, we run with him, legally speaking." Ezra's jaw worked. He looked at Silas. He looked at his mother. He looked at the floor. "So what do we do?" he said. Josie said, "We tell the truth." All three of them looked at her. "We tell the truth," she said again. "A wounded man came to our gate in a storm. We gave him shelter and medical care. We did not know about the desertion charge. When we found out, we determined to handle it through proper channels." She paused. "And Silas is going to write that letter to his contact in Miles City, today. And we're going to send Hattie in with it tomorrow morning like it's ordinary business, because it is ordinary business." Silas was watching her from the doorway. "That's a risk," he said. "Everything is a risk," she said. "The question is, which risk is worth taking?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face, not quite what she would have called emotion, more like the recognition of something he hadn't expected to find. "All right," he said. "I'll write the letter." I went to the table and sat down, and Josie gave him paper and ink, and he wrote for 20 minutes in a tight, precise hand, while the rest of the house moved carefully around him. When he was done, he folded it and handed it to Josie without sealing it. She looked at him. "Read it if you want," he said. "You should know what's in it before you send your daughter with it." She read it. It was direct and spare and honest, in a way that made her chest tighten. He laid out his situation plainly. The order he'd refused the civilians. He'd stayed for the name of the officer who'd filed the desertion charge, and at the end he said simply, "I am asking for your help, not because I deserve it, but because there are people here who do." She folded the letter and sealed it. "Hattie," she said, "first thing tomorrow. The post office, not the general store. Don't tell anyone where you're going." "Yes, Mama." Hattie took the letter. Ezra was still standing in the middle of the room. He hadn't moved through any of this. He was looking at Silas at the table, and his face was doing something complicated. The anger still there, but bent around something else now, something that was trying very hard not to be respect and not entirely succeeding. "If this goes wrong," Ezra said, his voice rough, "if any of this comes down on my mother or my sisters or my brothers, then it's on me," Silas said. He looked at the boy directly. "I understand what's at stake here, Ezra. I understood it before I let your mother put that bar on the back door instead of sending me out into the rain." He paused. "I'm not going to pretend I don't owe this family more than I can pay. I know exactly what I owe." Ezra looked at him. A long, measuring look, the kind that a 15-year-old who is trying to become a man gives to a man he is trying to decide whether to believe. He didn't say anything. He put his hat on and went back outside. Which was, Josie knew, as close to acceptance as Ezra was capable of just now, and she would take it. She looked at Silas at her kitchen table, and Silas looked back at her, and outside, the wind was picking up, and somewhere down the valley, a dog was barking at something in the distance, something moving through the dark that none of them could see yet. But it was coming. She could feel it the way she felt everything in the hollow of her chest, in the steadiness of her own breathing, in the particular quality of quiet that a house gets right before something changes inside it. She sat down across from Silas and put her hands flat on the table and said nothing at all, and he said nothing either, and the lamp between them burned low and steady, and outside the dark held whatever it was holding. And in the back room, Bertie slept with her chest rising clean and even, and Clementine, who watched everything and said nothing, stood in the hallway door and looked at the two of them sitting at that table in the lamplight, and her lips moved. No sound came out, but her lips moved. Hattie came back from town faster than expected. Josie heard the horse before she saw her daughter, the hooves coming hard up the track, the way they only came when someone was pushing past ordinary speed into something urgent. She was at the stove and she set down what she was holding and moved to the door and had it open before Hattie had finished pulling up in the yard. Hattie's face was the color of milk. She swung down and grabbed her mother's arm before she'd finished dismounting, which was not a thing Hattie did. Hattie was deliberate and composed, and she moved through the world with her father's measured precision. She did not grab people. "They're coming," Hattie said. "Crane's men, and a deputy. I saw them leaving the sheriff's office when I was at the post. They had horses, and they were riding this direction, and Tom Aldrich was standing on the feed store porch watching them go, and he saw me see them, Mama. He knows I know." Josie absorbed this without moving. "How far behind you?" 20 minutes, maybe less. I rode hard." "Did you send the letter?" "First thing, before anything else. It's sent. Good girl." She turned. Ezra. Ezra appeared from the barn at a run, reading his mother's posture before she said a word. He was holding a pitchfork, and he dropped it when he came through the gate, and his eyes went to Hattie and then to Josie. "What happened?" "They're coming. Deputy and Crane's men together." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to listen to me and do exactly what I say. Can you do that?" "Depends on what you say." "Ezra?" A beat. "Yes, ma'am. Get the deed box from under my bed, the one with your father's papers and the land documents. Bring it to the table. Don't run walk, because Sam is watching you from the window, and I don't want him frightened before I'm ready to talk to him." Ezra glanced at the window. Sam's small face was indeed pressed to the glass. He straightened and walked into the house at a normal pace, and Josie watched him do it and felt the particular painful pride of a mother watching her son choose the harder right thing over the easier wrong one. She turned to Hattie. "Go find Silas. He's at the creek line. Then go to the creek line." She kept her voice even. "Tell him what's coming. Tell him we're not hiding anything and we're not running. Tell him to come to the house and sit at the table like a man with nothing to conceal." She paused. "Tell him it's time." Hattie nodded and went. Josie went inside and looked at Clementine, who was in her corner, who had heard everything, whose dark eyes were moving with the rapid, quiet calculation that went on constantly behind her silence. "Come sit at the table, sweetheart," Josie said. Clementine got up without hesitation and came to the table and sat. Sam came away from the window and pressed himself to his mother's side, and she put her hand on his head briefly. "Are bad men coming?" Sam asked. "Some men are coming to ask questions," she said. "That's all." "What kind of questions?" "Grown-up questions. You're going to sit quietly and let me handle it." "Can I have a biscuit?" Despite everything, something in her chest eased slightly. "Yes," she said. "You can have a biscuit." She was putting the deed box on the table and the biscuit in Sam's hand when Silas came through the back door. He'd come directly, no delay, no hesitation. He came in and looked at her, and she looked at him, and there was no need for a long conversation. That was something she'd noticed about him over the past week. He didn't require explanations when the situation was already clear. "How do you want to play this?" he said. "Honestly." She pulled out a chair. "Sit down. When they come in, you're a man I gave medical shelter to in an emergency. You've been recovering. You've been working for room and board. You are not hiding. You are not afraid." She looked at him directly. "Are you?" He met her eyes. "No." "Then sit like it." He sat. Ezra came back with the deed box and set it on the table and stood behind his mother's chair with his arms at his sides, and Josie noted that he'd left the rifle in the house but had not brought it to the table, which was exactly the right call, and she didn't say so because he didn't need her to. They heard the horses 8 minutes later, not 20 minutes 8. They'd come faster than Hattie's estimate. Josie heard them in the yard and heard the jingle of tack and the creak of leather, and then the sound of boots on her porch steps, and the knock at the door was 3 hard raps, official and flat. She opened it herself. The deputy was a young man, younger than she'd expected, maybe 25, with a badge that looked newer than his boots, and the expression of someone who had been told what to do and was earnestly trying to do it. Behind him on the porch stood 2 of Crane's men, and behind them in the yard, Crane himself sat on his horse without dismounting, watching. "Mrs. Hale," the deputy said. "I'm Deputy Carver out of the Miles City Sheriff's Office. We've received information that you may be harboring a man wanted under a federal desertion warrant. A Silas Wade, formerly of the 13th Infantry." "Come in, deputy," she said. She stepped back from the door. He came in. Crane's men came in behind him and spread slightly without being invited, which told her everything she needed to know about who was actually running this visit. The deputy saw Silas at the table, and his hand went toward his hip and stopped when Silas didn't move. "That's him," said one of Crane's men. "Deputy," Josie said before the man could speak. "That is Silas Wade, and he is sitting at my table because I asked him to sit there, and I asked him because this is my home, and he is my guest, and I will not have my guest treated like a criminal in my own kitchen until someone shows me a legitimate reason why he should be." She kept her voice calm and her hands folded in front of her. "Now, you said a warrant. I'd like to see it." The deputy blinked. He hadn't expected that. He reached into his coat and produced a document and handed it to her, and she read it the same way she'd read Crane's survey, carefully beginning to end, not skimming. "This is a military warrant," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Issued by the Army of the Potomac." "Yes, ma'am." "In 1864, she looked up. "Deputy, this warrant is 22 years old. It has not been reviewed or reissued by any civilian court, which means its jurisdictional standing in Montana Territory is at minimum contestable." She set it on the table beside the deed box. "I am not a lawyer, but I know enough to know that a 22-year-old military warrant does not automatically give you the authority to remove a man from a private residence without a civilian court order." Silence in the room. Crane's man on the left said, "She's bluffing." "I am absolutely not bluffing," Josie said pleasantly. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the deputy. "Deputy Carver, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it carefully. Did the order to come here today come from your sheriff, or did it come from Virgil Crane?" The deputy's face moved. It was a small movement, the kind that answers a question without the mouth being involved. "Because," Josie continued, Virgil Crane has a separate legal proceeding pending against this property regarding water rights and land boundaries. And if this visit is connected to that proceeding in any way, if Mr. Crane is using your badge to accomplish something a lawyer couldn't accomplish in court, then you and he both have a significant problem on your hands. Crane's man took a step toward her. Ezra moved. Not far, one step forward, planting himself between his mother and the man, and it was such an instinctive and absolute movement that everyone in the room registered it. "Son," Crane's man said. "Don't," Ezra said. His voice didn't shake. The deputy held up his hand. "Enough." He was looking at Josie, and something had shifted in his face, the earnest compliance dissolving into something more careful, more his own. "Mrs. Hale. The warrant aside, Mr. Wade is a wanted man. I have a legal obligation to—" The sound came from outside. Horses. Multiple horses, and not the 4 that had already arrived. More. Moving fast, and then pulling up in the yard, and then voices, several of them, and one that cut through the rest with the particular authority of a man who does not need to raise his voice to be heard. "Deputy Carver." The voice came through the open door from the yard. "I think you'd better hear what I have before you do anything you'll need to explain to a federal judge." Every head in the room turned toward the door. Josie walked to it and looked out. In the yard on a bay horse was a man she had never seen before, perhaps 50 broad through the shoulders, with a silver-streaked beard and the kind of face that has spent long years outdoors doing serious work. Behind him were 6 other riders, and 2 of them wore federal marshal badges that caught the afternoon light. And riding at the man's left, looking like he hadn't slept in 3 days and had ridden without stopping, and didn't care about either, was a man she almost didn't recognize. Older than Silas, heavier, with a cavalry officer's bearing that years of civilian life hadn't fully erased. He looked at Josie from the saddle and said, "Is Silas Wade still alive?" "He is," she said. The man closed his eyes briefly. Just for a second, relief, pure and physical, the relief of a man who has been afraid of one specific answer for a long time. Then he opened them and swung down. "My name is Colonel Marcus Holt," he said. "Retired. I served with Silas Wade in the 13th Infantry, and I have testimony documentation and a witness deposition that is going to end this warrant today." He looked past her into the house. "I'd like to see him." Inside, Silas had stood up from the table. He was standing very still in the middle of the kitchen, and his face had done something Josie had not seen it do before it had come undone. Just slightly. The control that lived in every line of it cracking open around something that was too large and too old to fully contain. "Marcus," he said. Holt walked through the door and crossed the room and put both hands on Silas's shoulders and looked at him the way men look at each other when they have been through the kind of thing that doesn't translate into ordinary language. "You stubborn son of a, you should have written me," Holt said. His voice was rough. "I didn't think you could fix it. I've been trying to fix it for 4 years. Holt's jaw tightened. 4 years since I found out what Greer did. 4 years of collecting testimony and hunting down witnesses who were afraid to go on record. He reached into his coat and produced a thick envelope, not the thin folded document of an ordinary letter, but something substantial, official. Greer is dead. He died last winter. And before he died, 2 of his own men decided their consciences needed clearing. He held up the envelope. Signed depositions, both of them, confirming that the desertion charge was filed to cover a dereliction of duty order that would have resulted in the deaths of 43 civilians. He looked at the deputy. "This goes before the federal land office in the morning. The warrant is finished." Crane's man said, "This doesn't affect the water claim." "The water claim," said the man with the silver beard, who had come in behind Holt, and who now produced his own documents from a saddlebag he was carrying, "is what I'm here about. My name is Robert Ansell. I practice territorial land law out of Miles City. I received a letter this morning that included a copy of a deed with language that directly contradicts the survey Virgil Crane filed last week." He looked at Josie. "Mrs. Hale, I believe you sent that letter." "My daughter sent it," Josie said. "Then your daughter may have just saved your homestead." He set his documents on the table beside the deed box. "The appurtenance language in your deed is unambiguous. Crane's survey was drawn by a man named Pell, who has filed 4 similar surveys in the past 3 years, All of them subsequently challenged, 2 of them overturned. I've already sent a complaint to the Territorial Land Office. He looked at Crane's man. I'd suggest you ride back to your employer and tell him that the next legal action taken in this matter will be against him. The room was very still. Outside through the open door, Josie could see Virgil Crane still on his horse in the yard. She watched him receive the information, watched it come through his riders and his men, and reach him in the slow way that information reaches a man who is used to controlling which information reaches him. His face didn't change much. It didn't need to. The rigidity of it said enough. He turned his horse without a word and rode out of the yard. His men followed. The deputy stood in the middle of the kitchen for a long moment, with his warrant in his hand and his face doing the work of a young man, recalculating a great many things simultaneously. Then he folded the warrant carefully and put it in his coat pocket. "I'll need copies of those depositions for my report," he said to Holt. "Already prepared," Holt said. The deputy nodded. He looked at Silas. He looked at Josie. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I apologize for the disruption." "You were doing your job, deputy," she said. "That's nothing to apologize for." He left. His horse's hooves crossed the yard and faded down the track, and then there was quiet. The particular quiet that comes after noise has been sustained long enough that its absence feels like something present. Sam broke it immediately by saying very clearly from the corner where he'd been sitting with his biscuit, "Is it over?" "Yes, sweetheart," Josie said. "It's over." "Did we win?" She looked at the room, at Holt, with his hand still on Silas's shoulder, at Ansel spreading documents on her table, at Ezra standing behind her chair, with his arms at his sides, and his jaw finally unclenched at Hattie in the doorway. With tears she was too proud to let fall at Bertie on Hattie's hip, blinking sleepily at the commotion she'd woken up to. At Clementine. Clementine was standing beside the table. She had moved from her corner during the confrontation. Josie hadn't seen her move, and she was standing very close to Silas now, within arm's reach, looking up at him with those wide, dark eyes. And Silas was looking down at her. Something moved between them. Not words, not gesture, just the particular current of understanding that passes between two people who have been watching each other from a careful distance and have finally closed it. Clementine lifted her hand. She placed it very slowly on Silas's arm. The room went completely still. Silas looked down at that small hand. He looked at it for a long moment, and his face, the face that had held through every crisis of the past week, that had remained level through pain and confrontation and the weight of his own history, broke open fully now, silently, in the way that only happens when something that has been clenched for a very long time finally releases. He put his large hand over hers, gently, like something he was afraid of damaging. "Did we win?" Sam asked again, louder. "Yes, baby," Josie said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "We won." Holt looked at Josie over Silas's shoulder. He had the expression of a man who has ridden 3 days in a hurry and found something at the end of it that he hadn't anticipated. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I don't know how you held this together. But Silas, he wrote to me about this family. Wrote to me 4 days ago when he sent the letter about the legal contact." He paused. "He said you were the most capable person he'd encountered in 20 years of knowing capable people." Josie looked at Silas. Silas was looking at the table with Clementine's hand still under his, and his jaw was working with something he was not going to say in front of Marcus Holt. "He didn't tell me that," she said. "No," Holt said. "I imagine he wouldn't." She looked at Silas for a moment longer. Then she turned to her kitchen and said, "I expect everyone is hungry. Sit down." And because that was what she did, because that was who she was, the woman who fed people when words ran out and cooked when the world was too large to hold and kept moving forward, because standing still had never been an option. She went to her stove and started making dinner for a kitchen full of people, some of whom she'd known all her life, and one of whom she'd known less than 2 weeks, and all of whom she realized she would feed again tomorrow, without question. Outside, the sun was going down over the Montana Valley, and the water ran clean in the creek that was still hers, and the fence posts held along the line that Silas had checked post by post. And somewhere in the back room, Bertie made a small sound that was not a cough, but a dream, and Ezra set the table without being asked, and Sam talked to Marcus Holt with the complete social fearlessness of a 6-year-old, and Hattie stood at the window and let her tears fall quietly where no one would see them except Josie, who saw everything, and Clementine sat beside Silas at the table and did not speak. But her hand found his again briefly under the table's edge, and this time nobody needed to see it for it to be real. Marcus Holt and Robert Ansel stayed 2 nights. Holt slept in the barn with his men and ate at Josie's table and spent the better part of the first evening going through the legal documents with Ansel and Ezra, laying out exactly what had been filed and what would be filed, and what Crane could and could not do from this point forward. Ezra sat through all of it. He asked questions, good ones, precise and practical, and Holt answered them with the seriousness you give a man, not a boy. And Josie watched her son receive that and grow an inch inside it. Silas sat at the far end of the table and was mostly quiet. That was his way in groups present, but not pushing, listening more than talking the way a man listens when he's learned that information is more valuable than the sound of his own voice. Josie refilled his coffee twice without asking, and he thanked her without looking up from the document he was reading. And it was such an ordinary small thing that it almost startled her. The ordinariness of it, the way it felt like something that had been happening for years rather than days. She went to bed before the men finished talking and lay in the dark and told herself she was tired, which was true, and told herself that was the only reason the ordinariness of it had caught her the way it did, which was less true, and eventually she slept. In the morning, Holt found her in the yard and told her the federal filing would be complete within the week, and Crane's claim would be formally invalidated within the month pending standard review. He said it the way a man delivers good news when he's not entirely sure the recipient has allowed herself to feel it, yet carefully watching her face. "You understand what this means," he said. "The property is secure. The water access is secure. He can't touch you through the courts, not on this." "I understand," she said. "Silas told me what you did, keeping that warrant off him while you worked the legal angle. Most people would have turned him over." He paused. "Why didn't you?" She looked across the yard to where Silas was checking the horses with Sam trailing 2 steps behind him, narrating a story about outlaws that Silas appeared to be listening to with genuine attention. "I made a calculated decision," she said. Holt watched her face. "Right," he said with the tone of a man who has known Silas Wade for 20 years and can recognize the particular way people talk about him when they're not ready to say the true thing yet. He didn't push it. "He's a good man, Mrs. Hale. He's been a lost one for a long time. Those aren't always the same thing, but in his case they are." "I know," she said. And then because it was Holt and he'd ridden 3 days and it seemed fair, "I know he is." Holt nodded and went to saddle his horse. They rode out after breakfast, Holt and his riders and Ansel with his saddlebag full of documents, and the yard was quieter without them. The ordinary sounds of the homestead reasserting themselves the way they always did after a disruption. Chickens. Wind. The distant sound of the creek. Sam's voice carrying from somewhere behind the barn. Silas stood in the yard and watched the riders go and didn't move for a moment, and Josie, watching him from the porch, understood what that stillness cost, the particular weight of watching the last connection to your old life ride out of sight, even when that old life had been painful. Even when you were glad to be free of it, the leaving still cost something. She went back inside. It was Ezra who changed first, and Josie saw it happen, the way you see weather change over open land, gradual, and then suddenly, all at once. It started on the 3rd morning after Holt left. Silas was working on the roof of the small storage shed. Climbing was hard on his side, and Josie had told him not to do it, and he'd listened politely and done it anyway, and one of the boards gave way under his foot, and he caught himself on the beam, but it was close enough that Josie from the yard pulled a breath in sharply. Ezra was up the ladder before she could move. I didn't say anything. He didn't offer a hand because Silas didn't need one. He'd already caught himself. But Ezra was there on the roof 2 feet away, and he stayed there for the rest of the morning, handing boards up from below and holding things steady without being asked to. And when they came down at noon, Ezra's shoulder briefly touched Silas's in the narrow space of the ladder, and neither of them moved away from it. That was all. But Josie saw it, and she knew what it meant. A boy who has decided to trust you will not announce it. He will just stop watching your hands for weapons. The change in Clementine came slower and faster at the same time, slow in building, sudden in breaking. She had been sitting closer to Silas for days, gravitating toward whatever room he was in, positioning herself within his line of sight, the way a plant positions itself toward warmth. He never pushed her to speak. He never acted as though her silence was a problem to solve. He talked to her sometimes short practical things, the kind of sentences that didn't require answers, and she listened with the complete focused attention she gave to everything. On the 7th day after Holt left, Silas was oiling the hinges on the back door, a small job, the kind he seemed to find by instinct. The things that needed doing, that no one had gotten to, and Clementine came and stood beside him and watched. He handed her the oil rag without comment. She took it. He showed her the motion press turn release, and she did it, and the hinge stopped squeaking, and she looked at what she'd done with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Then she said, "Better." One word, barely above a breath. Silas went very still. He didn't make a sound. He didn't look at her directly, the way you don't look directly at something wild that you are afraid of startling. "Yes," he said in the same quiet tone she'd used. "Better." Josie was inside, and she heard it through the open window, and she pressed her hand flat against the wall and stood there for a moment and breathed. When she came out to the doorway, Clementine was handing the oil rag back to Silas, and her face was its usual composed, watchful self. But something had shifted in the set of her shoulders. Something that had been held very tightly for a very long time had given a fraction of an inch. That night, Josie cried. Not in front of anyone. In her own room with the door closed and her hand over her mouth, the way she'd learned to cry in the months after her husband died, quietly, completely, and then done. And then, she cried for her daughter, and she cried for the 7 months of silence, and she cried for the fact that it had taken a wounded stranger oiling a door hinge to find the crack in the wall that all her mother's love hadn't been able to locate. She was not ashamed of this. She understood that healing doesn't always come from the expected direction. She just needed to cry about it in the dark before she could hold it in the daylight. She dried her face and went out and finished the dishes. Silas found her the next morning before the children were up. He did that sometimes, woke early, and moved quietly through the house, checking things, the way a man who has learned not to sleep too deeply checks a perimeter. She was at the stove, and he came in and sat at the table, and she handed him coffee without a word. They sat in the early quiet, and she thought about what Holt had said, lost and good at the same time, and she thought about the way Silas had held Clementine's hand under the table, and the way he listened to Sam's impossible stories with genuine patience, and the way he had sat with her through the legal documents at midnight, treating her like a person with a mind worth consulting. And she thought about how alone she had been. Not the alone of no people around her. The children were always there, but the other kind. The kind that lives inside a specific silence between two adults who are managing something too large for one person to carry without their arms eventually giving out. She hadn't let herself think about that kind of alone in 6 months. She'd been too busy surviving to feel it. She felt it now. "Silas," she said. "Yes." She looked at her coffee cup. This was not like her. She was not a woman who approached things sideways. She approached things directly, always had, because the sideways approach wasted time, and time was the one thing she never had enough of. So she looked up and she said it directly. "What are your plans?" I was quiet for a moment. "I don't have any." "You're a free man now. The warrant's gone. You could go anywhere." "I could." "Is there somewhere you want to go?" He looked at her, the gray eyes direct and still. "Not particularly," he said. Her heart did something she refused to name. "There's work here," she said. "Real work. The kind that doesn't end. The north pasture needs clearing before fall. The shed roof is only half done, and I don't have the money to hire anyone right now. I could pay you in room and board until the harvest comes in, and then—" "Mrs. Hale." She stopped. He had a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled stillness, something different. Something that was sitting with difficulty inside a man who had spent years learning to want very little, because wanting things was a liability he couldn't afford. "I'm not going to stay here as your hired hand," he said. Her chest tightened. I understand. No. He set his coffee cup down. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that's what this is. I'm not going to pretend I'm here for the North pasture. He looked at her steadily. I have been in a great many places in my life, Mrs. Hale. I have done things I am proud of and things I am not. I have been lost for long enough that I stopped expecting to find anything. He paused. His jaw worked. And then I fell off my horse in your yard in the rain, and your daughter had weapons, and your son looked at me like I was something to be neutralized, and your baby couldn't breathe, and you sat on that floor all night and did not break. Not once. Another pause. I have never met anyone like you, and I have been trying very hard not to say that out loud, because you are a woman with 5 children, and a homestead, and a great deal on your hands, and you do not need a man with a complicated history making your life more complicated. The kitchen was very quiet. Josie looked at him. She thought about saying something practical, something about timing, something about what sense or no sense. It made something about what the children needed, or what the land needed, or what she needed to do before the end of the month. All of those things were real, and she could have said any one of them. Instead, she said, "You already have." He blinked. "Made my life more complicated," she said. "That happened the night I dragged you through the door. The complicated part is done." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. The question is, what comes after complicated? Silas looked at her for a long time. "I don't know how to do this," he said, and the honesty in it was so unguarded that it almost hurt to look at a man who has been alone so long that the ordinary mechanics of belonging have become foreign to him. "I know how to work. I know how to fix things. I know how to be useful. I don't—" He stopped. "I don't know how to be part of something." "Neither did I," Josie said. "After Thomas died. I knew how to be a wife and I knew how to be a mother, but those are roles. The person underneath the role had to figure out how to keep existing without someone to exist beside." She looked at him. "You learn. You learn because the alternative is to stop, and you don't stop." He was quiet. "I'm not asking you to be Thomas," she said. "I'm not asking you to fill a shape that someone else left. I'm asking you—" She stopped, started again. "I don't say much, Silas. You've been here 2 weeks and you know that. I don't say much, and when I say something I mean it." She held his gaze. "Don't leave." The words sat between them. Not a request exactly. Not quite a command. Something in the space between the two, the kind of sentence that can only be said once and means everything it's possible to mean. Silas looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at the table, and then he looked at his hands, and then he looked back at her, and when he spoke his voice was not entirely steady. "I should tell you," he said, "that I am not an easy man. I wake up at 4 in the morning, and I check exits, and I am not comfortable in crowds, and I have 20 years of habits that aren't all good ones, and I don't—" He stopped. "I don't have much to offer." "You saved my daughter's life," Josie said. "That's not—" "You fixed the fence line and the shed roof and the back door hinge, and you listened to Sam's outlaw stories for 45 minutes yesterday without once telling him to be quiet." She looked at him steadily. "And you found the one way through to Clementine that 7 months of everyone trying couldn't find." Her voice came very close to breaking on that last part, and she did not let it. "Don't tell me you have nothing to offer." Silas's jaw was tight. His eyes were bright in a way that a private man would not want anyone to notice, so Josie looked at her coffee cup to give him the privacy of it. The back door opened, and Sam came in with his boots on the wrong feet and his hair going in 4 directions, and said with complete confidence, "Silas, the gray horse is out of the north gate," and then turned around and went back out, apparently expecting the situation to be handled. Silas stood up automatically. He looked at the door Sam had gone through, and then at Josie, and something moved across his face, the involuntary, uncomplicated response of a man who has just been claimed by a 6-year-old who did not bother to ask permission first. "I'll get the horse," he said. "I know," she said. He went out. She sat at her kitchen table and listened to his boots cross the yard and Sam's voice pick up immediately in an account of how the horse had escaped that involved considerable dramatic detail, and she sat there with both hands around her cup and let herself feel what she'd been not feeling for 2 weeks, the fullness of it, the terrifying, ordinary warmth of a house that had someone in it who was there by choice. He came back 20 minutes later with the horse and Sam and Mud on his boots, and Hattie was up by then and starting breakfast, and Ezra came in from the barn, and Clementine appeared silently in the hallway, and Bertie woke up calling for her mother in the clear, strong voice of a child who had forgotten she was ever sick. Josie got up to get Bertie. She passed Silas in the doorway, and he was looking at the room at all of them, the noise and the movement, and the particular beautiful chaos of a family morning. And his face had the expression of a man who has been standing in the cold for a very long time and has just stepped inside. She stopped beside him. She didn't touch him. She just stopped, and he looked at her, and she said quietly enough that only he could hear, "I don't say much either, but I know when someone becomes family." His throat moved. He didn't answer because he couldn't not right then, but he stepped fully through the doorway into the kitchen. He didn't stand at the edge of it. He crossed to the table and sat down, and Hattie put coffee in front of him without asking, and Sam climbed onto the bench beside him and resumed the outlaw story at full volume exactly where he'd left off. And Silas sat there in the middle of all of it and did not look for the exit. That was the morning that everything settled. Not perfectly. Nothing was perfect, and nothing in this life came without cost. And there were hard months ahead, and a harvest to get through, and a 10-year-old learning to use her voice again, one word at a time, and a 15-year-old learning that strength doesn't require isolation, and a woman learning that asking for help is not the same as giving up the thing that makes her herself, but settled. In the way that a foundation settles, when the right things are placed in the right places, and the weight is distributed properly, and the structure is built to hold, not just for one season, but for all of them, the good ones and the brutal ones and the ordinary ones that make up the majority of a life. Silas Wade had come through Josie Hale's gate, half dead and empty-handed, running from a past that had followed him anyway, and he had found at the end of his running not an escape, but an arrival. Not a place that needed nothing from him, but people who needed exactly what he had and had exactly what he needed and were willing to do the slow, honest work of building something real from the ground up. He stayed. Not as a stranger who had outlasted his welcome. Not as a hired hand working off a debt. Not as the man who had saved the baby or fixed the fence or cleared his name. Those things were done and settled and behind him. He stayed as a man who had finally, after 20 years of knowing how to be useful and not knowing how to belong, learned the difference between the two. And in that hard, bright, demanding Montana life, in the noise of Sam's stories, and the quiet of Clementine's growing voice, and the sharp intelligence of Hattie's questions, and the slow unbending of Ezra's trust, and the laughter of a little girl who had almost not seen another morning, Silas Wade stopped running. Not because he had nowhere left to go, but because he had at last somewhere worth staying.
Smooches to you too. Mwah. Love you. Hello, hijinks. How you doing, friend? All right. Thank you for gifting. Oh my gosh, such an automatic thing for sometimes for me to like do the shout out. Thank you so much for shouting out Danny. I appreciate you. Whomever did that. So I am kind of floored. Thank you so much for the bits. We can be friends. I need someone here to spread my jam. Oh my god. I love it. The Dino Buzz has arrived. It sure has. Hello everybody. How was your stream, Danny? What did you get up to tonight? I bet there was some amazing music. Oh yeah, you gotta do some booty dancing. We could do a shout out for hijinks at some point. So much music. Yes. I love it. I love that. I absolutely adore your music. It's so much fun to be in your stream when I'm able to be there. For folks that are new here, I do a little bit of everything. Cosplay was my gateway into makers and crafting. And I then slowly picked up knitting, crocheting, 3D modeling, 3D printing, pottery as well. I'm currently in a debate if I'm going to be going to Toronto to, oh, thank you so much, Together. Thank you. No worries, hijinks. You're good. if I'm going to be going to Toronto for a pottery workshop, because I got laid off last Wednesday. I am trying my best to figure that stuff out. So I'm going to do a pros and cons list after stream to figure out if I can budget it. For the good thing is I got way in advance notice, like 60 days notice. Okay.
You're not finished here?
Oh my goodness. Thanks for continuing the hype train. Love your faces. Much love. Many hugs to you all. I appreciate it. Thank you for the follow, Veely Mars. So yeah, and it's my very first one. I've never been through a layoff before. I've survived many layoffs. And I guess it was my turn was here at this point. But yeah, so to give you all an idea of some of the things that we've done here, this is my first pottery that we've done in the home studio.